Good afternoon.
My name is Karen Grisez. I'm full-time public service counsel at the Freed Frank Law Firm in Washington, D.C. I appear frequently in pro bono matters before the asylum offices and immigration courts around the country, and I supervise and mentor other lawyers practicing before both of those bodies. I also serve currently as the chair of the ABA Commission on Immigration in Washington, D.C. And I'm going to ask my two co-panelists here to introduce themselves.
I'm Dr. Stuart Lustig. I'm a child psychiatrist and associate clinical professor at the University of California, San Francisco. And I've worked extensively with refugees and asylum seekers over the last 15 years or so, and am a co-author for the piece that's in your folders if you're here with us in the room, Psychological and Psychiatric Opinions in Asylum Applications, 10 Frequently Asked Questions by Fact Finders. Uwe Jacobs was the other co-author, and we'd like to acknowledge first off, our colleagues at the San Francisco Asylum Office, whose discussions with us really was the genesis for this paper and the discussion that we're going to have today.
I'm Dr. David Gangsel. I'm a licensed clinical psychologist in California. I've worked for the past 25 years in the field of rehabilitation of torture survivors at programs in Los Angeles and San Diego, and currently with CVT in Minneapolis. And I have been for many years an expert in the field of psychological documentation of the consequences of torture.
And is asked why they don't want to go back home. They may not have adequate English at that time, as you know, to make a coherent statement. And then when there's a follow-up credible fear interview, they may be intimidated by, for example, a male authority figure in a uniform who reminds them of a government official back home who brutalized them. And then when they get to an asylum officer, they may not have had the requisite level of psychotherapy to begin to integrate various traumatic aspects of their life experience in a way that they can talk about compellingly. And so these are all kinds of situational factors that can influence consistency. And our role is to try to explain the inconsistency where we can. And of course, if we cannot, then we'll have trouble also supporting an affidavit.
David, anything to add?
No.
Okay, we'll move to the next one. Do mental health clinicians, David, consider consistency to be an important part of evaluating the credibility of a person's story?
We certainly do consider consistency to be an important part. In fact, it's one of the most important parts of what we're doing. On some level, along the lines of what Stuart has already mentioned. But for a mental health evaluation, more broadly speaking, we're looking at consistency in terms of three basic areas. One is the report of what has happened to that person, both in terms of documents that we might have seen as part of our evaluation, but also in terms of how that is presented to us. Second is the behavior, the symptoms, the demeanor, the current emotional presentation or experience, the current cognitive presentation or experience, and anything about how that person acts with us and communicates with us in the course of the evaluation. That's our clinical data. And then third is the criteria for diagnosis of mental conditions according to the documents that we use in our profession, specifically for most of us the DSM-4. And the task is to ask the question, does the observed and assessed clinical condition coincide, or is it consistent with the nature of the events that have been reported and the criteria for diagnosis of those conditions? And if that's the case, then we're in a position to put together a picture that not only links these things, but that also personalizes and individualizes them so that the adjudicator or anyone reading the report will be able to get a sense of who is this person, as well as what they've suffered and how it's affected them.
So when I'm in immigration court, it seems that the consistency that's usually spoken of there is consistency from one statement to another over time. Consistency maybe from the border statement to the credible fear interview to the I-589 to the declaration and maybe other statements if there are any. But it sounds like You're talking about consistency in a broader point of view. Is that right?
That is correct, and that's what goes into a clinical assessment. It's also often the case that in a particular case, an attorney will ask us to account for, or at least to investigate, other kinds of inconsistency, as those of you mentioned, and Stuart already talked about that. Physicians are trained to make their clients comfortable and to create an atmosphere in which they can share things that are difficult, which is sometimes why information comes out in a clinical assessment that wasn't in a previous declaration. And that training allows us to approach these issues even in 1 or 2 interviews where that's necessary. So to get back to the history point, I'm going to want to know about the history. And as I do that, I'm going to be looking for what's the coherence and the nature cognitively by which the person describes that. What are the emotional reactions, as Stuart was saying, that come up in conjunction with describing particular events. And then those are the things I'm going to want to document. When she told me about the time when the military came into the home and dragged her and her husband out of the home, she started shaking and trembling and crying. If that happened, I write that in the report, or I even say she said, and when they came in, they did this, and then she started crying. So I want to get even direct quotes as well as descriptions of events. So, having gathered that information and arrived at my clinical assessment, what I decide to put in the report may be a much more limited version of that same thing.
Now, David, that